Now that AMD and Nvidia have spent what feels like the whole of this year, albeit we're only in February, releasing new graphics cards, or price-cutting existing ones, so it's given us a chance to produce some pretty nice head-to-head based content. And just the other week, we had the RTX 4070 Super against the RX 7800 XT. And based on feedback, it seemed that you guys and girls loved it. So we thought it was only logical to move up the stack and take a look at the RTX 4070 Ti Super and put it against the slightly cheaper RX 7900 XT. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video's sponsor.
Hello mate, you alright? Yeah, just got all the bits for my banging new gaming PC. Just got to put it together. It's going to be so much better than yours. Oh, right. What did you get then? The latest Intel 12th gen processor, a feature-packed motherboard, and 32 gig of DDR4 memory. See? Miles ahead of yours. You realise that board needs DDR5 memory, don't you? Don't tell me you went and bought the wrong stuff. DDR4 is so 2014. I can't believe you was that stupid. What? No, you're joking. What should I get then? For me, I'd be looking at Corsair's newest Vengeance DDR5 kits, or if you're wanting that all-important RGB, then go for the Dominator Platinum RGB. Oh, you are a lifesaver, thanks, but where can I find out more? By clicking the link in the description below, of course. And you call me the stupid one.
So I don't want to dwell on specs and figures because when you're comparing an AMD card against an Nvidia card, specs don't really mean all that much. They utilise different architectures and in a very different way. So while one could have more of one thing and less of another, it doesn't equally translate to raw performance. There are two figures that I do want to focus on though, the first being memory, as that's been, I guess, quite a big talking point as of late, that has seen both AMD and Nvidia scramble to release cards with bigger memory capacities to not only keep up with the latest titles of today, but hopefully be able to deal with the games of tomorrow as well. Especially as, there's been a lot of talk about is 8GB enough in 2024, is 12GB enough in 2024? So that's why the RTX 4070 Ti Super comes with 16GB of GDDR6X memory, a nice 4GB bump from the original 4070 Ti non-Super. The RX 7900 XT on the other hand goes one step further. Kind of, as it has 20GB of VRAM, but unlike Nvidia it uses the somewhat slower GDDR6, which is also more power hungry too, so you can probably guess how power consumption results are going to go straight off the bat. But it goes back to my point of things aren't equal when comparing two products from rival manufacturers. Now, one thing that is equal and easy to equate is price. Now, the 4070 Ti Super hasn't been out long, and when released it came in with a launch price of $799. And looking online, you can actually get the card for that price, and with a kind of small selection to choose from. So that's nice to see, especially after years of GPU pricing being flipped on its head. That being said, AMD come in one better due to its price cuts that have happened lately, taking the 7900 XT from its overpriced $899 launch price back in 2022 to now just $739. Now, I don't know AMD's reasoning behind it. I'd like to think that they finally listened to their customers and dropped it to a price that should have been that from the start, but it's more likely in a move to try and, beat Nvidia in that mid to high end range, especially as there is only sort of $60 to $70 between the two cards. So the boring stuff over, let's get into the reason you're here, benchmarks. Now in typical eTeknix crazy fashion, we've put both cards through rigorous testing in 42 games at 3 resolutions. To test, we put the cards onto our GPU test bench with an AMD Ryzen 7 7800X3D on a Gigabyte B650E Aorus Master, with 32GB of Corsair Vengeance RGB 6000MHz CL30 dual channel memory. All of our testing was done on Windows 11 with the latest updates applied and with the latest BIOS revision for the motherboard. The driver used was Nvidia's 555.15 driver and AMD's 24.1.1 driver, and we tested in 42 games in total, of which we'll be focusing on about 16 today, before jumping into the percentage differences of all 42 games. We will be showing 1080, 1440 and 4K results today, as these cards really are able to hit some pretty decent numbers across the board, and that's where these cards are aimed at in the market. We'll also be looking at the cost per frame too, though as always, if you want to check out all of the charts for all games, they will be available to our Patreon supporters where you'll get a ton of other cool exclusive benefits. The link for that is, as always, down below. So, with that out of the way, let's get into those glorious benchmarks. So getting started with A Plague Tale Requiem, where it's clear to see that AMD come out on top at every resolution. The question is, by how much? Well, at 1080p, the 7900 XT comes out 15% faster, which, considering Nvidia are around 8% more expensive, is not a good start. As we move up in resolution, the gap widens to 27% at 1440p and a pretty stark 50% more performance at 4K, with the AMD card being the only one that now sits well in excess of 60 FPS. Baldur's Gate 3 sees results fall much more in line with each other, with a margin of error 2% difference in favour to AMD at 1080p, a larger 6% more performance again in favour to AMD at 1440p, and a similar 5% extra performance at 4K. While these margins aren't as big as what we saw in A Plague Tale, the big thing here is in the 1% lows, where AMD consistently, and in some cases like 1440p, sees 36% more performance in the lows, which will certainly be noticeable in more intensive scenes of the game. As we move on to Call of Duty, AMD take a full house yet again with 28% more frames at 1080p, 29% more at 1440p, and 24% more at 4K, showing that the cheaper 7900 XT is clearly the winner in terms of pure rasterization, especially with the trend that we're seeing in every single game. Nvidia's only hope really is in ray tracing, as it's already not looking great for Team Green, but we do still have a lot of games to go through. Cyberpunk is a game that has always favoured Nvidia, but even here the 7900 XT shows that it's no slouch, as it again pushes ahead of the 4070 Ti Super in all resolutions. At 1080p we're looking at a 6% margin in favour to Team Red, which, considering the price disparity between the two cards, is not a great look for Nvidia, while 1440p sees that gap grow to 13% ahead, again to the 7900 XT. At 4K the game is still playable, but it's below where most gamers would want things to be on both cards, but AMD still hold the lead by 20% in the averages. As we enable ray tracing, we see our first win to Nvidia at all three resolutions. At 1080p and 1440p, the 7900 XT now comes in 35% slower in the averages, while 4K still keeps a strong lead of 33%, showing that Nvidia really do have the upper hand when it comes to ray tracing performance, though that was pretty much expected, and gives an argument for both cards depending on the type of games that you play, and if you're enabling ray tracing or not. F123 is a game that dishes out huge frame rates, and at 1080p, that performance difference equates to 29% more performance in favour to Team Red at 1080p. It's the same at 1440p, with the 7900 XT coming in 29% faster, and now giving faster performance on the 7900 XT than what Nvidia were actually able to get at 1080p. The margin shrinks slightly at 4K, with AMD coming in 25% faster, though to play devil's advocate, both cards are in excess of 200 FPS, and nothing like you'd ever notice anyway. Again, much like in Cyberpunk, as we enable ray tracing, Nvidia show that they still have a fight in the game, as they come in faster at every resolution. That's definitely a testament to what AMD have been able to do, as the margins are now much smaller. We're now seeing AMD come in 2% slower at 1080p, 6% slower at 1440p, and 9% slower at 4K. So it's a win for Nvidia, but considering the 8% higher price tag, the performance other than at 4K doesn't really line up, as I'm sure Nvidia would want it to. Moving on to Far Cry 6, and at 1080p AMD managed to hold the lead, though only by a small 3% margin, but looking at the figures it's clear to see that both cards are being held back ever so slightly. As we move up in resolution, the bottleneck disappears and AMD hold a much healthier 15% lead over Nvidia, and an even stronger 17% lead as we look at the 4K data. Switching ray tracing on, and we actually end up with some pretty interesting results. At 1080p, Nvidia hold a 5% lead over AMD, while 1440p and 4K see AMD fighting back. At 1440p, we're talking a margin of error 3%, but it's still a win, while 4K sees that gap widen to 9% faster performance from the cheaper 7900 XT from AMD. In Hogwarts Legacy, AMD again come out on top in terms of rasterization performance. At 1080p, Team Red packs 13% more frames, while 1440p sees improvements beyond that, now with 17% faster performance overall. At 4K, we still see a decent difference of 15% in favour of AMD, and coming in just over 60 FPS, while Nvidia dip just below at 54 frames per second. Turning ray tracing on, our standings do switch up with Nvidia now coming out on top. At 1080p, both cards are still seeing in excess of 60 FPS, which is always nice to see, but AMD now fall 14% behind Nvidia's RTX 4070 Ti Super. As we move up in resolution, 1440p does see both cards now below 60 FPS, but again AMD slip behind by a larger 22% margin. 4K sees the biggest difference though between the two cards, with AMD now pushing 37% less performance, but with both cards now either at or below 30 FPS, upscaling really is the only way you're going to have an enjoyable experience. Spider-Man sees Nvidia fight back in terms of rasterization performance as AMD come in 7% slower at 1080p. 1440p still has Nvidia on top, but we're talking margin of error differences of 2%, which, considering the extra cost involved, doesn't really see it as much of a win in all honesty. And it's a similar affair then at 4K, with just 3 FPS between them, again in favour of the 4070 Ti Super. Now, with the price cuts now in place for AMD, even when Nvidia win, it feels a bit like a hollow victory, but our cost per frame will further confirm that anyway. With ray tracing switched on, again AMD do fight back, but also fall slightly short. All 3 resolutions are more than playable on both cards, and while Nvidia lead the way at all 3 resolutions, it's not by much. At 1080p, the 7900 XT falls 7% behind Nvidia, and a similar but slightly increased 8% behind at 1440 and 4K. Now, considering the AMD card comes in 8% cheaper, I'd actually say based on performance, it's bang on the money. In Ratchet and Clank, AMD regains its top position across the board. At 1080p, Team Red managed to come in 10% faster, while the higher up in resolution that we go, the slimmer that margin gets, as 1440p only sees a 4% difference between them, and 4K has a single frame per second between the cards. Now, without repeating myself every time, for those unaware, Ratchet and Clank has some severe issues with 1% lows that always favours AMD. And while the 1% lows are much lower, it doesn't actually seem to affect overall performance, but it's definitely something the developers need to address. Luckily for Nvidia, when you turn ray tracing on, those issues seem to disappear, as we now see the 7900 XT trailing 26% behind Nvidia's 4070 Ti Super at 1080p, and a slightly larger 27% behind at 1440p. Now, as we move up to 4K, the margin also increases to 32%, but we're now into the territory of being classed as unplayable, though again, upscaling could change everything for both camps. Finally, in the last game we're looking at, Starfield sees similar performance from both cards, with just a single FPS in it at 1080p in favour to AMD, though the lows do suffer somewhat on the 7900 XT as it falls 10% behind. It's a similar story at 1440p, with AMD chalking up a margin of error 4% win in the averages, but again falls behind in the lows, this time by 8%. Then, lastly, at 4K, AMD takes the win by a 4% lead, with the lows smoothing out with identical 57 FPS performance. So, some pretty interesting results, and it's clear to see that AMD have really managed to step up in terms of performance, especially considering the price tag that AMD have now managed to come in at. What was clear to see is that AMD are the king of rasterization between the two cards, ever so slightly. And while Nvidia do come out on top in terms of ray tracing, AMD weren't that far behind there either, and that's something Nvidia should definitely be worried about. Luckily, Nvidia do still hold one ace up its sleeve when looking at upscaling, but AMD are working hard to bring their equivalent to market in a big way, but they're still behind, so there's definitely an argument for, I guess, both of these cards at the moment. But given a few months, I guess that could all change. Now, while we did show 16 games today, as mentioned, we actually tested both cards in 42 games. And with anything, the more data we have to compare, the better analysis we can actually make. It's here when looking at 1080p, the RTX 4070 Ti Super actually manages to edge ahead by 3%, mainly due to the ray tracing based tests that we do. And while we've had comments on how we should show charts without ray tracing performance, I kind of feel that's a bit unfair, as both cards have their merits, and it's easy to see from this chart as to where the wins and the losses come from, and then you can just make your own informed decision. Instead, we are testing both cards to their fullest, and it's, I guess, not really our fault that Nvidia do have superior ray tracing performance when compared to AMD. Now, AMD do still have some pretty sizable wins by the way of Red Dead Redemption, F123 and Call of Duty, so there's definitely arguments for buying the 7900 XT. But the biggest one is that while Nvidia are 3% faster overall, they are also more expensive. So unless the extra functionality of DLSS is worth it to you, then you can easily say that AMD are the winner here. Then, as we move up to 1440p, the gap does actually shrink. We now have Nvidia still ahead, but only by 1% across the full 42 games. AMD still holds strong leads in quite a few titles, but Nvidia is clearly the favoured card again when it comes to ray tracing, as the biggest leads come by the way of Cyberpunk with RT enabled, Ratchet and Clank with RT enabled, Hogwarts, Warhammer and Doom Eternal, again, all with RT enabled. But there are some other games worth looking at, like Flight Sim and Redfall, which hold strong leads in pure rasterization performance. So again, there's kind of arguments for both here. Then as we move up to 4K, it's the same story. Nvidia come out 1% faster and held similar wins, with the bulk of them coming by way of ray tracing based tests, and AMD winning in pure rasterization. Though the likes of Hunt Showdown and again Microsoft Flight Sim do favour Nvidia with 45% and 24% faster performance overall. Now, one other chart that I actually did want to show was the 1% lows for 4K, because this does give some, let's say, interesting results, especially in the ray tracing based tests where AMD seemingly suffer, as you'd expect, and in some cases quite badly. Hogwarts Legacy is the biggest point of contention, with 200% faster performance compared to AMD, followed by Cyberpunk, which always tends to favour Nvidia in terms of ray tracing anyway. Hogwarts is definitely what I class as an outlier, and if we omit it from the results, then both cards are actually evenly matched in the lows. Nvidia do have bigger wins, but AMD has more of them, hence the cards coming in evenly matched in the lows. So I guess the big thing here today, performance differences aside, is going to come down to value, because they are so similar. It's definitely the biggest argument right now, especially with performance, as I say, being very close in a lot of cases, and kind of points being able to be made for both sides. AMD for rasterization, Nvidia for ray tracing, but how do things actually look overall? Well, when we look at the overall averages and cost per frame at 1080p, there really isn't much in it between the averages at 203 FPS for Nvidia and 204 for AMD. So if they were priced the same, it really would come down to which brand you prefer and their respective technologies. You could even class it as, with 1 FPS difference, you guessed it, margin of error. Now, considering the price difference, that definitely does go in favour to AMD, as they come in at $3.62 per frame compared to Nvidia's $3.95 per frame. But that is only at 1080p, and higher resolutions do tell slightly different stories. At 1440p, the overall average gap does widen, with Nvidia sitting at 154 FPS and AMD at 160. So again, not a huge amount in it. But in terms of the cost per frame, we're seeing the 4070 Ti Super coming in 54 cents per frame more expensive. Now, looking at the complete picture again, there's more to it. The 7900 XT has been out for well over a year, whereas the 4070 Ti Super is still the new kid on the block, having only been out for less than 2 weeks. So of course, the more recent card is going to be the more expensive. What's also worth noting is that there are cheaper cards beyond that, like the 7800 XT, which offers up great value for money, but its performance is obviously much lower than the cards we're looking at today. So really, it's in a completely different segment and price bracket of the market. But what I'm trying to say is you have options. Then, lastly, at 4K, again, there really isn't much in it when looking at overall averages, with the 7900 XT coming in at 90 FPS and the 4070 Ti Super at 87, so 3 frames. But again, considering AMD are the cheaper of the two, that separates the cards by a little under $1 per frame, which is actually quite a big difference for what is arguably the same performance. But I will drill down a little bit more into the pricing side of things when I wrap things up. Now, before I do that, the last thing I want to look at, something that you guys have always asked for, is power and temperatures. Because given the fact that Nvidia typically are better at efficiency, and how they're using GDDR6X compared to GDDR6, like AMD are, it's pretty obvious as to which way this will end up going. Now, when we look at the total board power at 1440p, it's clear to see that Nvidia have the upper hand by quite some margin, with some of the biggest differences coming by the way of Ratchet and Clank with RT enabled, where Nvidia uses 32% less power overall. Even with ray tracing to one side, games like Assassin's Creed Valhalla sees Nvidia using 27% less power. So how does this actually equate to temperatures? Well, what this means for them is AMD actually come in the better of the two, by anywhere from 1 to 8 degrees, so something that I didn't really expect here. But this could obviously come down to the fan curve on the AIB card we used for Nvidia versus the AMD reference card. There are also some cases where the temperatures came in identically, like Assassin's Creed Valhalla and the Callisto Protocol. Either way, all temperatures were kept under control, and really you'd have nothing to worry about with either of the two cards. As we move up to 4K, the power consumption reads very similar. Their differences aren't as big, but there's still some fairly wide gaps where the Ti Super uses 22% less power than AMD in the likes of Hogwarts Legacy with RT enabled. Again, there are some titles without ray tracing where it tells a similar story, again like Assassin's Creed Valhalla with Nvidia using 20% less power, while some results do draw closer, but Nvidia consistently comes out as the card that uses less power in every game. We've tried to be as fair as possible with the analysis, some with ray tracing, some without. Again, temperatures are still well under any numbers that would cause concern from both cards, but AMD do have more wins than Nvidia, where we're talking either matched heat output, like in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, to bigger differences to the tune of 8 degrees, in the likes of Warhammer Darktide. Temperatures are always an odd one, as it's almost like comparing apples to oranges, and again, with fan curves, it can easily make the difference of being cooler or hotter. So, how do I even start about summing this one up. It's simple, right? AMD is better value, so go buy the AMD card. Thank you and good night. If only everything was as black and white as that. Sadly, that's not the case because yes, the AMD is the better value card, and across the multitude of games we tested, it was pretty even with Nvidia overall, even with ray tracing thrown into the mix. So AMD have managed to do some great things with the 7900 XT, especially now that it is at a much, much better price point compared to the frankly ridiculous one it was when it launched. And that's happened over time, and that's the thing that AMD has going for them. Due to the length of the time that the 7900 XT has been on the market and the pressure from consumers either being vocal about the price versus the performance, or just really simply being heard through their wallets and not buying the card at its original inflated price, AMD had to do something. And well, it's a great move to see this now coming closer to $700. Now the big thing, while the 7900 XT is one of AMD's best selling in the stack, they are still, as a whole, Nvidia versus AMD, kind of lacking behind them. And that's not being kind of being a shill for Nvidia or fanboying, because the only thing I'm a fan of is value. And right now, AMD have the best value, right? Well, kind of. Nvidia is still the front runner in other areas like image quality, arguably drivers, but I'm not even going to get into that one. And of course, upscaling technology, CUDA acceleration that can be used in non-gaming tasks, and as we saw, efficiency. AMD are making strides, don't get me wrong, but they are still behind. So I guess it can be looked at both ways. If you're all about gaming and you don't care about upscaling, of which AMD is behind on, AMD is actually the right choice. But if you're a streamer or a content creator or just a hardcore gamer who cares about maximum performance through conjunction with DLSS and with frame generation, then Nvidia is worth the extra $70. To me, $70 isn't a whole lot more money to get all of those extra features, but I also fully understand that some people are on a budget, and the 7900 XT is an easier pill to swallow if the money is tight. Heck, if money is that tight, then as our cost per frame chart showed, there's even better cards to have if you're all about value. While some people are all about that life, there's definitely other areas to consider. So, in summary, if you want a great AMD card for gaming at any resolution, then the 7900 XT is great. If you want a great Nvidia card for gaming at any resolution, the 4070 Ti Super is great in comparison. So which one should you buy? Either of them. Sorry. It's probably not the answer you're looking for, but it's one of the toughest battles that you'll find right now. Each have their merits, and for very, very different reasons. We're also toying with the idea of having an upscaling showdown, so if that's something you want to see that, I don't know, could potentially change things a little bit in the near future, let us know in the comment section, because it will open up even more arguments, and likely in favour of Team Green. So all you Nvidia shills can be happy about that one, and you AMD fanboys can, I don't know, cry in the corner. For now, that's going to do it for this one. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, then a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you love what we do, then you can help support us over on Patreon, where you get a ton of cool exclusive benefits, including access to all the charts for all the games that we tested, a super special area over on our Discord, bi-weekly game nights, and much, much more. The link is, as always, down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.